yes, it's something similar to that. By the way, in answer to your earlier question, I, Robot, the version with Will Smith, that has nothing
Oh,
to do with the film. If you've read the Asimov book, essentially it's a film that has robots in it, and it's called I, Robot, and I've run out of similarities with the book. So
and
that
this
that
is
one I
yeah, like, and I do get a bit of a divided position because I have to admit I did enjoy the film enough, and so like. Part of me wishes I would love to see a more accurate adaptation. Yet I wouldn't want to see the film non-existent. It's like, and so it's hard to like yeah, that puts me in a rock and a hard place with that one.
well, don't call it I, Robot then.
That's a good point, actually.
Call
If
it
they're going to
Will
be
Smith
changing
versus the robots.
that's a very good point. They seem to just want to use the fan base or of a pre-existing property and then make whatever the hell they want. And there are some atrocious examples lately. Like, I have never read Artemis Fowl. I don't know if it's a good book or not. All I know is that the recent movie has been trashed in the reviews.
Have you seen it?
And no, I haven't even seen the film because
I've watched it, and it is trash. Really, it was not enjoyable. It was too fast-paced. Nothing was... Well, everything was explained, but nothing was shown. That's a common error that they make.
Yeah, and so there have been some atrocious adaptations more recently, and other ones that do a decent job, and sometimes that do they really good, and then they kind of like Game of Thrones. They started great, and then there was a bit of a stumbling towards the end. But yeah, so it's always like when dealing with adaptations, it can be a complete like. Random result if it's going to be either accurate or good. Those are the two big ones. And a lot of the seems like a lot of the issues that happens is the authors just get locked out of getting solid input. The one that disappointed me, if you're going to ask me about adaptation, probably Ender's Game. I love Ender's Game, the novel. It is a brilliant one, and the movie, it worked on some levels, but it didn't reach how awesome the book was by far. And so, it's unfortunate. And again, they basically like Awesome Scott Card is a savagely intelligent guy. He can be hugely critical. Like if you ever watch him in an interview, he has views and he'll just throw them out there. And I can respect that, even though I might not agree with all the hot takes he has. But tell you what, he has some good views on how his story should be. He's the author. Of course he knows the nature and core of the characters and the better ways that they can be conveyed and things. And not only did they not use him as a resource in terms of making the film, they specifically contradicted fundamental things he had tried to get in the contract itself, but they put in a loophole in the contract so they could then do the exact opposite of the things that they were even committing towards. And so that is almost like a nightmare for me if my book ever gets adapted into film, is just seeing someone do whatever the hell they want with it. And which has made me really reluctant even considering allowing people to make adaptations and stuff. And I haven't even sold the feature film rights yet. Diratia Productions, they have the rights to make a short film. And that's why I'm like, let's see what you can put together, fellas. Let's see what you can make. And they've been impressing me at every turn. And so, the possibility of a feature is absolutely there. And so if ever we get funding, that's something we can pursue. But it is something that I've been very hesitant about, and just giving off all the rights. And so that's kind of where I was at in terms of selling it to Hollywood and things, even though Hollywood isn't interested in it as of yet. But
I think there is a certain amount of job justification in studios. So they'll bring some studio exec will take on the project, and if he just says, "Yeah, tick, I like that one, do it," Vum, he hasn't done anything. He's not shown his expertise. He hasn't added any value to that product. So he feels it's necessary for him to interfere. And then he can say, "Oh yeah, when they brought it to me, I said this act is too long, and this character doesn't add enough, and this character needs a sidekick, and we need a funny dog in it." And one thing they particularly love doing is changing the title, because then the whole film becomes their idea. So Shadow of the Conqueror, if it becomes Conqueror of the Shadows, or whatever, then that studio exec, oh yeah, I created Conqueror of the Shadows. He will be able truthfully to say in that he changed the title to that.
And if the video does great, it's all thanks to them. And if it does poorly, it's everyone else's fault.
Doubtless.
Yeah.
Studio execs.
Yeah, I mean, you hear some of these horror stories about the meddling that can happen. I mean, sure, Rise of Skywalker, I won't even get started on. Anyway, but it's pretty cool. Like, I mentioned this at the beginning, but this is the first time me and Lloyd has ever even had the opportunity to just talk directly like this, which is brilliant. And so we're probably going to steer things towards that way, just to have a bit of a chat, really. And you guys can still have the opportunity to ask questions and everything. But one thing that I would love to get your insight on, Lloyd, is one of the, I guess, themes of your channel where there's obviously a focus on historical accuracy and a push towards getting things more authentic, even in fantasy, but obviously a greater focus on if it's a period piece, absolutely. Why do you feel that's an important kind of thing to promote and to aim for?
Because when I pay my money and I go to the cinema, I want to be taken to another world. And anything that pops the balloon reminds me that I'm watching a movie. So if the acting is bad, I recognize that it's acting, and I'm reminded that these people are actually actors. And then I'm sitting in a cinema, smelling the popcorn. I'm not in that world because the acting was bad. If the special effects are bad, I spot that they are special effects, which reminds me that I'm just watching a film, which pops the balloon again, and I'm back into the cinema. I don't want to be in a cinema. I pay for escapism, damn it. I want to be immersed in this believable world. And if there's a massive anachronism, then that pops the balloon again. Now, you might argue, but not everyone in the audience knows it's an anachronism. But actually, I think when people see the real thing, even if they don't know why, they appreciate, oh, yeah, it was like that. You don't have to be an expert for verisimilitude to help with immersion.
I agree completely. Just on that note, I don't mean to cut you off. It's just that because if realism exists, like the things, basically what I'm trying to say is things were done because they were for good, practical, sometimes even fashionable reasons, but they were done for reasons that made sense once you understand them. And when you adopt those same, realistic elements, even if in fantasy, because they have such a logical basis, usually, I admit some things you look at and like, where the hell did that come from in history? But then when you research it, you can find out. But generally, there is a very explainable reason for it. And when that's added into, especially if it's period, but even in fantasy, it increases the believability because it has that practical, grounded sense, especially if you look at armor and things. Like, realistic armor looks realistic and functional because it is, funnily enough.
Yeah. One thing, one thing I think I could say about period piece is that a lot of people watch period movie and think that it's accurate, and they're gonna take things from it and say, well, this is how the medieval times were. How many people have watched, let's say, Braveheart and thought that that's how it was back
I
in the
don't
day?
think anyone has watched Braveheart and thought that was... I mean,
Well, this is the thing.
That is one of the least accurate movies ever made. But
I know.
But actually, no, it's a good example, actually, because there was, on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, there was a shop called the Braveheart Shop, and it was there for a few years, and it sold tourist tat Scottishness to Scots and tourists. And there was a Braveheart, I think it was referred to as the Braveheart effect, and it actually supposedly was responsible for a shift of votes towards the Scottish Nationalist Party and a lot of eating of shortbread. And wow, that film was so inaccurate. It was jaw-dropping in almost every possible way.
Well, this is the thing, right? I mean, when you say who would be fooled by it, me. Like when you come into, because like as a kid, swords are awesome. knights, they look cool, action, fighting. And so you come in knowing nothing. And then the very first thing you get depicted is Kevin Costner. Like this is still, nostalgia, still one of my favorite films. There are issues with it, but Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner, right, is one of the first introductions to the medieval world as a kid that I experienced.
Oh
dear.
Dear.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And with knowing nothing, that was medieval to me. Like, look at the studded leather everywhere and all these things. Like, there is some howlers, right? But because I didn't know any better, that actually educated me falsely as to what medieval was. And then it created a self-perpetuating myth, because when I go and as a kid, when I went into medieval, that's the aesthetic I was expecting, because that's what I had been conditioned to receive, because it was the only thing I had seen. And then Braveheart is another example, because I actually didn't know when kilts were introduced, but I see this period, they're all wearing kilts. It's like, okay, yeah, Scots, kilts, they must have wear, and of course kilts were introduced way later after, the events in Braveheart.
Yes, and they didn't paint themselves with blue woad either.
Exactly. Braveheart didn't have a massive two-handed claymore. William Wallace, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, didn't even have a bloody bridge in it, like...
there's a clue in the name, guys.
Exactly. There are howlers in Braveheart or Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, but because, being young, I didn't know any better. I just, that was it. And that's where I feel inaccuracies do a disservice to history when they're not, because in a lot of instances, and look, I might be speaking out of a place of ignorance here, but in a lot of instances, I feel it would be as much effort to get things accurate as the effort you went to in the inaccuracies. Like putting all these stats on leather takes a lot of work. I mean,
yes. Sometimes they seem to go out of their way to get it wrong.
Yes, exactly.
It happens, for instance, in Britain, where we have these wonderful reenactment societies, and they recruit. They want a load of people to play some medieval whatnot, so they recruit from reenactment societies, and people turn up in their meticulously researched, down to the last stitched, accurate kit, and the costume people take one look at it and go, "Oh no, that'll never work," and then they give them a load of sackcloth, and then throw buckets of shit over them.
Oh, that's depressing. Because I like my thought when I ever see these horrible kind of all the extras in this horrible armor, my reaction was, why don't they get the reenactors as resources? And you're telling me they do, and then they give them crap instead of what they have. That is depressing.
Embarrassing. Yes, I know this has happened to several people I know.
Oh gosh, no, that's horrible.
Yeah, because as we all know, you can look at medieval paintings and all the people are wearing bright colours, but as we all know, really, because we've watched movies, everything was brown or black and everyone was covered in mud. Because the damp cloth wasn't invented until the 1960s.
If you're a bad guy, you have to be wearing a black hood, obviously.
Well, yeah, because that's causation. It's wearing black hoods send you bad.
I know, and especially I feel sorry for Sinestro. What is he supposed to do given a name like that from birth? It's like, gee, I'm sorry. It's just what's going to happen, mate. But yeah, absolutely. I'll go.
One interesting exception is a film which I think is better than the book, which is Dangerous Liaison. Have you seen that?
I have not, in fact.
Oh, see it. It's a hoot. It's really good. And the book was written in the 18th century, I believe, and it was an epistolatory book, like Dracula. It's all in letter form, and they changed it in a number of ways for the film. One thing is that they set it earlier, so they set it in about 30 years before, when people were wearing the enormous wigs and everyone had powdered faces and incredibly elaborate costumes. And it actually sort of suits the story a bit better, maybe, to have put it back.
Well, no, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Changes like that can be done and they can actually enhance the source material when they're done with consideration and actual understanding of the source material. Because we're not saying that every adaptation, if it's a historical adaptation into the real world, that tweaks to realism are always bad. Like my point of reference is usually fight scenes, because in reality, most fight scenes are 1 to 2 exchanges, and then that's it. Okay, that's how they play out in the real world. Yet in a film setting where you want something heroic and engaging, I kind of all right. For myself, I'm actually a bit okay with pushing realism to get a fight scene that's more elaborate and drawn out, to be more epic and heroic, and that's even if it's in a historical setting, because it's more enjoyable. Put simply. And so
I think you can have a historical fight that drags on.
Yeah.
Like
that's
if you have a duel with 2 guys in full plate armor, it can last quite a long time before one of the guys go down. It's just
I should redeem myself in what I was saying and just clarify that I'm not saying use horrible techniques and bad stances and over swinging and the spinning around crap in fight scenes. I hate all that. I'm talking about the length and the amount of engagement and stuff.
But I mean, if you watch an MMA fight, sometimes it goes.
You're right.
It goes for 5 rounds, and those guys are expert punchers, and they're hitting each other really hard in the face over and over again. And sometimes the first punch wins it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And because it'll come down to a word that I think we're all familiar with here, context. Where is he? Is he coming? No, we're safe. We might have avoided the Matt East.
You can put him in post.
Absolutely. It's always a matter of context, because there are times when a wholly realistic fight scene that does only last a few engagements works way better for the given scene and for the type of film and everything like that. And so when I say that you can tweak realism, it's always going to be a case-by-case basis and what works for what you want to achieve. And that's kind of the mindset that you want to approach. But overall, I generally do feel erring on the side of stuff that creates more immersion, especially accuracy, if it's dealing with historical or historically inspired material, generally has a much greater chance of enhancing the work instead of being a detriment to it.
I think there's a lot to be said for things happening off screen. Sometimes what you don't see is more powerful. I think a lot of films, particularly since CGI has become a thing, now that you can show the thing because you can CGI it, when it used to be impossible, they sort of feel it's necessary to show it. And sometimes it lowers the impact. In the black and white a David Lean version of Oliver Twist, when Nancy is being murdered by Bill Sikes, you don't see it. What you see is Bill's dog trying to get out of the room frantically. And in the background, you hear a woman being beaten to death. And it's really powerful.
Yeah.
Whereas today, some studio exec will say, oh, no, you'd have to show her head being bashed in. We want blood and what have you. We need to be able to show it all. But actually watching that dog, trying to get, I don't want to be in this room, says the dog by the way it moves. It's whoa, that's visceral and powerful. And one way to do a very effective fantasy fight could be you see a door and then you hear stuff and then you see little flashes of light come through the cracks in the door, and then after a pause the door opens and a guy covered in blood walks out, and it all happened in your head. And sometimes that can be better.
That's actually a writing tool I also employ in my work, where I know that someone's imagination would be able to create something far grander than I could explain in detail, and it would take way too long if I tried to explain it in such detail. And so that's when I can resort to using descriptive kind of broader statements like their sword fighting reflected a dance that was so complex and yet so sophisticated and something like that. And just saying something like that paints or gives someone a jumping point to paint a picture that is far greater than what I could have actually written. And so it's always a balancing act. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's you can really use some creative things because people have imaginations. So Lloyd, what would be your most despised film that is the best example of atrociously adapting a medieval period? It can be fantasy, it can be history. What do you think is the worst? What does it the worst?
It's a little bit boring if I pick Braveheart now, because that's already been mentioned. But it was particularly reprehensible. Not only was it so unrealistic in terms of costumes and setting and have you, but it had an agenda. It was sort of aggressively inaccurate. They changed all sorts of things in order to make the English better bad guys and the Scots better goodies. And they even had Irish fighting on the Scottish side. What? And the whole reason for the war was changed. I mean, to give you an example, in the film, he doesn't attack Carlisle, where in reality he murdered all the nuns in Carlisle Abbey, but presumably they didn't think that was a heroic thing to show. But he attacks York and takes it. He never got anywhere near York. He attacked Newcastle and got his ass handed to him. You know, that is. But you know, they just wanted to. It suited them to show the English being beaten up by the Scots at that point, and presumably the execs thought, "Oh, no one's heard of Newcastle. Let's have him attack York. People have heard of that."
That's an interesting pet peeve you've touched on there that annoys me, is when they actually go out of their way to malign the character of historical figures to have a distinct protagonist and antagonist in a given film of a story. When I like, that bothers me a lot, especially when either it's grey and we don't know, and there's actually certainly like a pros and cons, like what you mentioned with William Wallace and Robert the Bruce is the same. He did some pretty vicious, violent stuff as well. And of course, the villain is always good old Longshanks. But from the English perspective, he was actually a pretty solid king. You know, he did some, and so it becomes to a matter of perspective and elements. And of course, there's always the historical context where things that we would think are horribly violent and brutish from our own perspective are actually, you know, in some cases more understandable in the historical context, given the nature of warfare and other things. I mean, but yeah, so that seems, I just wanted to emphasize that point even more about how characters are altered to give the protagonist or antagonist element, and it can really skew a historical depiction.
Yeah, I find that characters who are a shade of grey are just much more interesting. And
honestly, like I would love a depiction of Longshanks that is more fair and balanced, because he's always depicted as such a vicious villain. And admittedly, they did a bit better with Outlaw King, but he's still pretty much the villain, and especially his son. I would almost even like a film that tried to show the nuance, like the proper nuance, because it's just gone very far that he's always, and look, admittedly he did some pretty vicious things. I'm not saying he didn't, but there's perspective that should be accounted for.
A good example of a film that raised the bar, I thought, was, even though it did get loads of things wrong, was Saving Private Ryan. And since Saving Private Ryan, it's quite clear that you see a post-Saving Private Ryan World War II film, and you can tell.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't go back to the way they used to do things before that. And there are elements of that where it's the sort of thing where a studio exec would have said, "Oh no, we can't have that. People won't accept it." For instance, when they're landing on the beach right at the start, their rifles are in plastic bags. But because so much is right, and people can see that they've gone to so much effort, and it sort of makes sense. Oh yeah, they probably would have them in plastic bags, because you wouldn't want to get your rifle wet immediately at the start of a battle when you're trying to get off a landing boat onto the shore. So yeah, they would have given everyone a plastic bag. And so in that context, the audience did accept it. Oh yeah, of course. And even if they hadn't thought of it, they'd be going, oh yeah, of course, yeah, they would have given them plastic bags to put their guns in.
And it's just one of those logical, realistic elements that it doesn't need to be anyone to comment on. You can see it and just put the pieces together, and it can actually enhance a film. And just on the note of World War II, I do have to admit, like, your World War II content is the thing that sparked my interest in World War II. For me, before then, it was always medieval. But like, when you started making your videos on tanks and everything like that, it actually did open up the whole realization of what like both amazing and insane period of time that was. And it's just wow. So now
it was
I'm
an
actually
amazing generation that lived through that.
like unbelievably so. And the things that people sacrificed and endured and went through, it's just staggering. And the other thing is, like, so much of what we benefit for in the modern day was preserved because of what people fought for back then as well. And it's absolutely amazing. And so so I actually credit you for a lot of opening up that, you know, appreciation, interest for that period in time. Just to give you that credit that is rightly deserved for your content, mate. But I have to admit, I think my favorite video of yours is the bed video.
Okay.
Sleeping.
That's rarely at the top of people's
Well,
lists.
the reason why I love it, right? It shared such unique details that are rarely ever talked about and mentioned, that would actually have been far more common and prominent in the time period. And it's those kind of details that I particularly love. It's the ones that people don't really know, yet in contrast to that would have been so common and prominent in the period that I just eat up. And so that video has always stood out to me as one of my favorite.
Another thing I would like to ask you, Lloyd, did you listen to Band of Brothers? Did you watch Band of Brothers?
Oh, yes, great series.
Because I think that's also a good example of well-depicted World War II.
Absolutely, and that was produced by a lot of the same people who worked on Saving Private Ryan. And again, yeah, it shows. Steven Spielberg didn't direct much, but he was an executive producer. And so he engaged a lot of the same people to make sure that things were right. One thing I found a little bit odd is that there are a lot of very well-known British actors playing Americans in it. And if you are British, you go, hang on, I know him. I know him. So they sort of, so Simon Pegg is in it, for instance, playing an American. And just, I know that he's not an American and that's Simon Pegg. And that he dyes his hair blonde, and so when you see him playing a blonde American, so occasionally that you get those little jolts out of it. But yes, overall, very good, very good. Although weirdly, the sequel series, Pacific, was it called?
I didn't see that one.
They did another series set on the Pacific front, and it just didn't work. It's strange. But it just didn't have it. It's not easy to put your finger on it, but it wasn't compelling in the same way.
I didn't even know there was a sequel series. So,
well, there you go. It sort of sank without trace.
It seems like that.